I'll start by telling you who our suspect is. His name is Dwight Lamont Jones. He's a male, 56 years old. He is currently deceased. We had a standoff today that ended with his death. He took his own life at about 8:02 this morning at the extended stay located at 10660 North 69th Street. I'll take you back through the timeline as to how we got here today. And really, this all began for all the agencies here on May 31st. At approximately 5:20 p.m., Phoenix Police Department responded to the office of Dr. Stephen Pitt. Many of you know who he is. He's a world-renowned forensic psychiatrist, famous for his work in many different cases, including the John Benet Ramsey case. He was shot and killed just outside of his office that day, and Phoenix Police immediately began investigating that case. And on one of those shell casings, we were able to obtain a DNA sample. Although we analyzed that sample and searched all the relative databases, we did not get a hit on who that would belong to. But they did have a witness. On that day, the witness described the suspect as a white male with a round face and a dark hat, without any further description. The following day, on Friday, June the 1st, at about 2:18 hours, the Scottsdale Police responded to a call at 7509 East 1st Street. This is the law offices of Burt, Feldman, and Grenier. And our call was of at that time, a young lady named Valeria Sharp was observed running from the business, bleeding significantly from her face. She ran westbound on 1st Street and across 75th Street, where she collapsed. She was transported to Honor Health Osborne, where she was pronounced deceased from a gunshot wound. Our officers entered the law offices looking for any additional victims, and at that time they located Laura Anderson lying on the ground, and it was evident that she had also been shot in the chest. They attempted life-saving measures, as did the Scottsdale Fire Department, but unfortunately those were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced deceased. As we investigated this scene, we were contacted pretty quickly by the Phoenix Police Department, and they were inquiring as to some information about our crime scene and if it was possibly related to their crime scene in which Dr. Pitt was murdered. They immediately responded to our command post, and we immediately began collaborating and sharing information to see if we could determine that. Ballistic evidence collected from our scene on 1st Street and the Phoenix scene did confirm that our victims were killed using the same weapon, therefore linking our cases. We reached that conclusion late in the evening, probably 11:30, 11:45. Just after midnight, we received a call, another emergency call. This time, our police officers were responding to 8010 East Morgan Trail, Suite Number 1. And this is an office complex in the area of Hayden and Mountain View. And at that time, we received a 911 call from a young lady named Pamela Ayers, who is the girlfriend of Dr. Marshall Levine. She was calling us because Dr. Levine had left to go to work that morning at 7. And she had not seen or heard from him since. And so she went to the office to see if he was still there. When she went in, she found him lying on the floor, and then called us. Our officers entered the office suite and observed that Dr. Levine was deceased and had suffered two gunshot wounds. Shell casings recovered from this scene, as in the previous, were compared to ballistic evidence from the other two scenes. We again had a match linking the homicide to the others. About 9:30 that night, on June the 2nd, we received a tip, and the tip was referenced Mr. Jones. We began working on the intelligence gathered on Mr. Jones, and the following day, we're working this all through the night, the following day on June the 3rd, 10 a.m., we began actively trying to locate Mr. Jones. At about 11:30 a.m., in analyzing evidence, we believe that Mr. Jones was in the area of a residence in Fountain Hills, somewhere between 12 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. We were actively trying to locate him, but we had not located him until approximately 3:20 p.m. on that day, where we actually physically saw him driving his gold Mercedes and positively identified him. Really, between 3:20 p.m. and close to 10 p.m., we had an active surveillance following Mr. Jones, monitoring his behavior and observing the places he was going and the things he was doing. At some point during that evening, we observed Mr. Jones remove a small bag from his vehicle. He placed it in a trash can in the area of Scottsdale and Shea. As he walked away from that, we recovered it, and we recognized immediately that it was a pistol. It was a small .22 caliber pistol, and that was inconsistent with any of our crime scenes as it relates to caliber used in these crimes. We felt very strongly about Mr. Jones as we learned more and more about him. He had a divorce situation back in 2009 and 10, and during all of that time, he was related to all of the victims in some way. And so as we surveilled him on that day, we began our surveillance somewhere around 3:27 in the afternoon, although we had some evidence that led us to believe he was in the area of 14906 East Kit Fox Place in Fountain Hills, somewhere between 12 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. that day. Not knowing his association to anyone at that residence, we first tried to determine that before we went and contacted them. But later in the evening, we decided to have the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office go to the residence and try to make contact. They tried several times, knocking on doors, going around the residence, and eventually, because they knew of our concerns, they used a ladder. They got to see through an upstairs window, and they immediately recognized that there was a gentleman inside that appeared to have been shot. They forced entry, and upon doing so, found another victim, a woman, who had also been shot, and both were deceased. Getting back to Mr. Jones, I started to tell you that we observed him put something into a trash can, a small .22 caliber pistol, and it was later determined that that pistol belonged to the male victim from that residence. Additionally, we had that DNA sample that we needed to try and determine who it belonged to. And so we had some family members of Mr. Jones that were in northern Arizona. With the help of the Phoenix Police Department Air Unit, we flew a detective up there in the middle of the night. The Coconino Sheriff's Office picked that detective up and delivered him to the family, where we received buccal swabs so that we could bring them back and have them tested by our lab. They flew back, and right around 12:30 in the morning, we began testing. That's this morning. We began testing that. Within about 4 hours, we had a positive hit on Mr. Jones. Now that connects him to all our scenes, and I'll explain why. Because that was on, if you remember, that was on a shell casing at the first scene, on Dr. Pitt's scene. Now ballistically, we have linked all the shootings except for the last one. We're still working on that one, the one in Fountain Hills. But all the other scenes we have linked to the same weapon. And now that we have Mr. Jones's DNA on a shell casing aligned with that weapon as well, that puts him in all those places. Additionally, we had a vehicle description from Mr. Jones. It was a 2001 gold Mercedes E320. It was rather distinctive, had specialized rims, had a unique plate on the front, and some surveillance video near the scene of Dr. Pitt's office picked up that vehicle, sort of acting strangely in and around the time of the shooting, backing into a spot, turning around, moving around again. and then we see that vehicle fleeing rapidly in what would be consistent with right after that event had occurred. This morning, the Phoenix Police Department Special Assignments Unit began evacuating units around his unit at the extended stay. They were very successful in that. They evacuated most of the first and second floor and were well into the third floor when we believe Mr. Jones detected their presence, and he began firing at them. Somewhere between 7 and 8 rounds were fired. All officers were safe and okay, and they began countermeasures to ensure that they could put him in a position of disadvantage. The gunfire stopped, and they methodically moved forward, clearing carefully, ensuring that they were safe. And eventually, in this action, they found that Mr. Jones had killed himself, self-inflicted gunshot wound.